Hi everyone, we will begin in less than 2 minutes. Hi everyone, we will begin in about a minute. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Mary Rubin and I'm the past president for the Society of Florida Archivists. Today's webinar is the last of our 2020 SFA Archives Month webinars. We will be holding all questions until the end of the webinar. Today we have Crystal Thomas, Digital Archivist at Florida State University, and Stuart Rochford, the Digital Library Center Studio Manager at Florida State University. And with that, I hand it over to Crystal.
Thank you, Mary, and good morning, everyone. As Mary said, my name is Crystal Thomas, and I am joined by my colleague, Stuart Rochford, to share with you our patron-driven and instruction-driven workflows for digitization at FSU. Today, we'll share how those workflows came to be, how they actually work, and also how they've had to change in light of the pandemic. We'll then sort of look beyond the pandemic and discuss these workflows and what challenges we see in continuing them forward when we get back to normal. So we'll start out with just a little context for you. The Digital Library Center, or DLC, as you'll hear us call it, was moved under the Special Collections and Archives Division in 2012, shortly after I became the manager of the staff and space, and then we brought Stuart on to be the in-studio manager in late 2012. The DLC primarily focuses on digitization of materials, but it's also the managerial home of the Digital Library, which lives under DigiNole, FSU's digital repository. Currently, the Digital Library holds around 63,500 objects in over 50 collections, and we average adding around 14,000 new items each year. Now, an item may be a one-page letter to a 500-page book, so that does vary widely. Digitization for a majority of that material is done in-house by the DLC's 3 full-time staff members. As the DLC has matured, we've expanded our digital projects to include campus and community partner digitization projects, as well as added a patron-driven and, since COVID, an instruction-driven workstream to the DLC workload. So now Stuart will give us more details about our patron-driven digitization workflow.
All right, hey everybody. So just to get a little bit more background on where our patron-driven digitization workstream came from. In previous years, and especially before the pandemic, most patron requests came from researchers perusing our collections in the reading room. And our small team in the Digital Library Center would handle almost all of these requests, taking them off the hands of special collections staff. In most cases, patrons would fill out a paper request form, return it to our reference desk staff, and it would eventually make its way up to our studio, along with the materials requested for digitization. Once the DLC received the material, we would digitize it and deliver the images to our patrons directly. And after a 3-month holding period, the images would be permanently deleted from our servers, and that was that. The patron had their request fulfilled, and we would move on to the next task. And this process, it was a bit clunky, inconvenient, and it left a lot of room for gaps in communication and production. So we faced the occasional problem of time being wasted as well on digitizing the same material multiple times, especially when dealing with material in our more popular collections. And we hope to address some of these issues to make our work in the DLC a bit more efficient while making changes to our workflows. And to tackle some of these problems, we came up with several solutions. With all this in mind, we eventually went from the paper reproduction request form to an online form, which could easily be found on the Digital Library Center's website. And patrons can now navigate through our online finding aids and catalogs to find material, fill out the online form, and have it sent directly to our online ticketing system. With shifting the DLC's focus towards larger scale internal digitization projects in mind, this shared ticketing system also allows special collection staff to assist in reproduction requests that don't necessarily need to come to the DLC for digitization. The online form has proven to be extremely helpful to both staff and researchers, especially during the pandemic, as special collections has been closed to the public and so much of our work has been done remotely. Also, now after delivering the derivatives to our patrons, we aim to upload them, even the smallest patron requests, to our digital repository so that other researchers can quickly find this material online in the future. And the philosophy behind this decision was pretty simple. If one researcher finds value in the object being digitized, then perhaps others might find it valuable as well. So this not only saves the time of our researchers looking for material, but it prevents us from getting overwhelmed with duplicate reproduction requests. So as I just mentioned, we noticed that the DLC was starting to get bogged down with an increasing amount of reproduction requests from our patrons, and that we needed some help with those. So many of these requests consisted of material that either couldn't be loaded into the digital library for various reasons, or that didn't require the use of our studio's more advanced imaging equipment. We also realized that many of these requests could be quickly handled by other staff in the special collections, and as a result, that would help free up valuable time for larger scale, more complicated projects. And it's also worth noting that shortly before the pandemic, Jennifer Fain, she's our awesome research center assistant, was helping out by taking care of some smaller reproduction requests that didn't necessarily need to come up to the DLC for digitization. These kind of requests primarily consisted of providing quick low-resolution scans for our researchers who were more interested in the contents of an item than a high-resolution reproduction. So in most cases, they were low page count items that could easily be scanned on a copy machine that we had in the research center. And an example of that would be this letter from Florida State University President Doak Campbell. Just quick one-off reproduction requests like this worked well that way. But unfortunately, when the pandemic hit, this process kind of fell apart, and the DLC once again started to digitize pretty much all requests that came through special collections and archives. However, we've been working hard to reintroduce collaborative processes into our workflows again, and it seems to be working out pretty good so far. And here we have just an image on the screen of two of our forms, the previous paper form on the left and our updated current form on the right, which is the online form. So as part of our goal to once again make digitization more of a shared effort, we started to rely more on this online form and ticketing system. Here you can see the older form that we just talked about on the left, and then the right, the online form, again, with a little bit more fields and some simplified language. The paper form was a bit more complicated, and it often confused our researchers with some of the more technical language, and it was generally just bad for the environment. It was 3 pages long, and we would have to use 2 sheets if we were printing double-sided. Keeping in mind that the university has been trying to go, has been making more of a concerted effort to go green, and printing out all of these forms wasn't really helping. So the online form has been a benefit in that aspect. So we simplified the form and created the one we see on the right, which provides all of the fields necessary to complete reproduction requests, along with some larger text boxes to add more notes to the staff if the request is a little bit more complicated and needs some more explanation. And once this form is submitted, it automatically gets sent to our RT ticketing system for all of special collections and DLC staff to take a look at together. And once in the RT system, the staff can claim, transfer, and resolve any requests that have been submitted via the online form. It provides us with a more transparent system that allows our department to easily check the status of any reproduction request. And our ticketing system can also track all correspondence between staff and patrons that our team can view, which has been extremely helpful, especially when the request involves multiple areas in the department. In the past, much of this correspondence would have been trapped in email chains back and forth, and the staff and patrons often left others in the dark who were not involved directly with the request. So if someone is left out also for an extended period of time, or sorry, if somebody is out of work for an extended period of time, or if a project is better suited for a particular staff member, these requests can be assigned accordingly via this RT ticketing system. And the implementation of this method of tracking patron requests was a major benefit to our patron request workflow, and it helps us focus more of our time on other digital library projects. Right. And so with the addition of our patron-driven digitization process to our other work streams, we had to figure out how to manage them all as efficiently as possible, with SCA Special Collections staff assisting us with digitizing material now for patrons. We focused on digitizing material for patrons that could also be uploaded into the digital library. And thanks to Crystal, the DLC now has some thorough reproduction request guidelines documentation that helps special collections staff decide when to consult with the DLC for reproduction requests and when they can handle these requests on their own without us. For example, if a book falls outside the scope of the DLC's digitization priorities made clear in this documentation, special collections staff can utilize a public book scanning station in the library to fulfill some reproduction requests. And we typically have a steady flow of projects in a DLC, which consist of internal digital library projects, community projects, instruction support projects, and patron requests. So prioritizing them effectively has been a little bit tricky, even more so now during the pandemic. And we try to make sure that we're utilizing all of the pieces of equipment in our studio to keep as many projects moving as possible. And this typically means we aim to have multiple projects going simultaneously. For example, we might have one project being handled on our flatbed scanner, another project being taken care of on our large format camera for oversized material, and another project for our book scanner to handle books, of course. And this process allows us to keep working on each of our primary work streams, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And that's still me, sorry. It became pretty clear to us that a better distribution of patron requests within the division was a huge benefit to our work, especially in relation to the pandemic. We still do handle patron requests occasionally, but we're being a lot more strategic about what requests we take on. For example, we have placed limits on how many pages an item can be requested before it makes its way to the Digital Library Center for digitization. And we've also become more consistent with taking on patron requests when we feel like the material would be a good candidate to include in our digital repository. And again, Crystal has created some impressive workflow documents and guidelines to help us determine what material does in fact belong in the digital library, so that we can continue to contribute to our other work streams, including our instruction efforts, instruction support efforts during the pandemic.
Okay, so as Stuart just discussed, we needed to adjust the patron-driven digitization due to the pandemic, but the pandemic also gave us an entirely new work stream to start to incorporate as well. As many of you did in higher ed in March of 2020, FSU made the shift to online instruction, which you heard about from our brilliant colleagues, Rachel Duke and Rory Grennan last week in an SFA presentation. It was also at this point that we started reimagining how digitization would need to support instruction in its new remote model. Starting March 23rd through May 1st, DLC staff worked from home, which meant that no new digitization could be done. We used this time to create a list of digitization priorities that would support remote learning for both the summer and fall semesters that we knew would be able to work on quickly once we were allowed back on campus. These priorities were identified in a couple of ways. One, digitization was recognized as a priority for both the instruction and public services working groups in special collections. So they brainstormed and shared materials that they wanted prioritized based on their curatorial, reference, and instructional experiences in the past. Secondly, I reviewed all previously created pull lists for instruction sessions going back to the fall of 2017. I specifically looked for materials we utilized in instruction consistently each year. I had two guidelines in this review. One, that the same object couldn't be available easily elsewhere online. And two, that copyright had to allow us within our risk tolerance to be able to put the selected objects into the digital library. Once I had my list of priorities, I prepped as much as I could for digitization to be able to begin immediately following our return to campus. I created project plans, created digitization prep spreadsheets, and also coordinated description needs for the material that had been selected. Which brings me to how we needed to rethink our digitization workflow. Typically, all description would be completed prior to digitization. We have found that description is one of our big bottlenecks, and especially due to digital storage limitations, we need to make sure description is completed prior to imaging to avoid creating a large digital backlog that overflows our storage. In this particular instance, though, we needed to digitize so that description, especially of our manuscript materials, could take place remotely. Loading would then, in theory, follow description quickly. So due to remote work situations, we actually wanted to create a digital backlog in order to provide remote work projects and allow the DLC to move forward on needed digitization without worrying about storage. This essentially moved the DLC completely onto the workflow that we only usually use for patron-driven digitization. That workflow, as you just heard, was usually used for a very small amount of material at one time. Instructional support digitization was trying to bring that workflow to scale to work for a lot more materials at one time. So starting May 7th, I returned to Stroger Library on FSU's campus one day a week, and then the rest of the DLC staff followed on a rotating schedule. Using all the prep work we did at home, I was able to pull materials, get them on the DLC shelves, and ready for staff to immediately start back to work. During the home prep, we'd rethought our usual prep spreadsheets and streamlined them to make what needed to be digitized very clear both online and on our shelves. You can see a detail of what we call our new and improved inventory spreadsheet here on the slide, which simplified what we used to create, but also took into account the metadata for materials would be created remotely. So we actually needed DLC staff to collect certain information that they normally wouldn't because they would be the only people to see the physical objects at this point. So you'll see they're collecting page measurements, which is usually something that would be done in prep for the material. We luckily already had a project management software in place to manage our work. We use Freedcamp extensively in the FSU libraries, which is a web-based product. And since we couldn't meet in person any longer in order to go over project plans or look at physical materials together, we relied heavily on Freedcamp in order to share information about projects and ask questions. We were also down a person when we returned to the library. We had a retirement in early April, so we needed to be strategic in who could be assigned what work. It also led us, as other people in the division started rotating back onto campus for work, to question and think strategically about what absolutely needed to be digitized in the DLC and what could be handled on other equipment elsewhere in the division, as Stuart mentioned earlier. One of the main challenges of this new workflow was managing expectations. We were getting this new workflow up and running. We were repurposing what we could from patron-driven workflow tasks, but there was things we needed to change. We were also working limited hours on campus, and again, we were down a person and knew we weren't going to be able to hire someone for a while. Plus, we still had our normal work to be doing, so we had a lot on our plate. To help with expectations, I worked to create guidelines for special collections and archives faculty to use to decide if they needed the DLC for instructional support work, or if digitization could be done through other means, such as using other equipment open to faculty to capture 1 or 2 images, if that's all that was required for a class, or using video to capture objects instead of still images. As with the patron-driven workflow, we wanted to make sure the materials ending up in the DLC queue needed to be there at a time when our resources were very scarce. We also were managing time expectations. We weren't necessarily getting the materials into the digital library fast enough if the request for instructional support digitization came in too close to when the class would be held. I worked to make sure that our instruction group understood that getting requests in by 2 weeks out from a class was cutting it close, but we could probably get the imaging done, but they wouldn't make it into the digital library in time. We very early early on realized that we had a challenge in using the digital library as a delivery system for instruction materials. It takes a lot of work to get materials into the digital library just outside of the work of digitization itself, and we don't always get information on class needs until it's too late to get them in. So we've started to rethink how to get materials done in time for instruction, but also how to deliver those images to classes. We've asked of our instructors and facilitators, both in the department and the folks we work with, when is content less important than the object? So for example, we have a chained book in our collection. You can see an image of it here on the slide. Its text is not as important as the book itself being an object is for the classes that normally want to see it. The chain, the binding, the story of why there's a chain attached to a book is used more than the text inside. So we took really good photographs of the external parts of the object to provide to classes through our online learning environment Canvas so that the classes could still see the object and use it in instruction while we worked to continue to digitize the text itself. Once we had the text ready, we loaded the book and the external photographs so that classes could get the best of both worlds through our digital library, and also all our other online users get the benefit of seeing the external photography of the object as well. So switching gears a little and starting to look ahead to when things get back to normal, whenever that may be and whatever that might end up looking like. Now that we have the stream of work to support instruction up and running, we want to make sure we don't lose it. It's actually a stream of work we've talked about creating for several years in the DLC, but something else always came up. There was always another priority. So I guess exciting we have it now. One good thing to come out of the pandemic. So as part of creating that work stream for instruction-driven digitization, as I mentioned earlier, we also have really clear guidelines now for when session facilitators can digitize themselves, what that actually means, and when they should involve the DLC in that work. We've also worked out guidelines for digitizing facsimiles when we absolutely could not find a good digital surrogate or substitute. And as part of those guidelines, we also worked out some easy to follow copyright rules to use when having to make quick decisions to meet instructional need. The division has been creating data sets for several years now about what materials we pull for instruction each semester, but we in the DLC haven't used that data yet to create digitization priorities. So that's what I plan to use for us to maintain this work stream moving forward. I think we're feeling good about what we've been able to put in place around instruction-driven digitization. It's not moving as fast as I would like. Nothing is right now. And we're still definitely figuring out some kinks into the system. But I think that the DLC has found a really good silver lining with our new involvement in instruction, and we definitely want to keep that moving forward. Continuing to look forward to the new normal, the DLC has some challenges ahead of it to get back into our good habits and leave some of the bad ones behind that we've had to pick up out of necessity. A really good example of that is one of the changes we had to make early on in the pandemic was to digitize while on campus and work on everything else while we were remotely, as I explained. What this did was bring us back to an old workflow, and we were very quickly reminded of why we didn't do it that way anymore. We had a lot of material waiting on description before it could go into the digital library, which meant we had a lot of images just sitting on our server, not going anywhere. There were a couple of reasons that our description list is kind of exploded. You can see a screenshot of it here. That's not all of it. We have fewer student workers that are working for us right now. We do have several that are working remotely. There's also been increased pressure on our metadata librarian from other projects, but also the spreadsheets he's receiving to process are potentially missing more information than usual. So he's having to do more work to process them. But I will say our student workers have been champs through all of this. They are dealing with changing workflows, they are dealing with poor internet connections, and they're dealing with a lot of trial and error as we figure out how this is going to work. For example, our student workers can't access our network drives from their homes. So we've had to learn how to use OneDrive to deliver materials to them so they can do description remotely. This has added processing on my end, as we found that PDFs were really the best type of file to put into OneDrive that they could easily access, but we don't create PDFs for everything we digitize. So that's added a level of processing to me to create PDFs to put into OneDrive so that they can access the material and do description. We also have run into a quality control bottleneck, which was a new one for us. Because we have less students and because also we're focusing all of our students primarily on description, that meant that DLC staff needed to be doing QC again, which was something we had mostly passed off to student workers. However, again, we don't want to take away from staff time on campus to be digitizing, so we try to do QC work remotely, but we very quickly ran into connectivity issues with the network from our homes. We've partially solved this by providing external drives to staff to copy the images onto for QC at home, which eliminates the network issue, but it still takes a lot of time at work to copy over all the images onto a drive. So I'm not entirely sure we have actually fixed the problem. There's just more time in a different place. So moving forward, we will definitely be returning to our description before digitization rule as soon as possible, as we've now remembered why we made the changes we did. And while we have been successful in moving a lot of our work online, we are definitely much slower. As you'll remember, I said we average about 14,000 new items into the digital library every year. We're on track to do about half that this year. We're also still dealing with a pandemic and dealing with internet connections and having to do lots of extra work to make our workflows continue to be successful if they're just moving a little slower. So getting back to good habits will be a goal when we return to campus.
So with the pandemic in full swing and as access to the DLC has been very limited, all of our timelines have been drastically skewed, and have been since loosened. We loosened up our deadlines for all projects considering how little in-studio time we have to digitize material. On our online reproduction request forms, we have updated the language to reflect that to our researchers that they should expect longer delays before receiving the images in efforts to manage expectations. Something else that we had to consider when scheduling our time in the DLC was the comfort levels of our staff working on campus during the pandemic. We staggered our schedules so that there is at most 2 staff members working in the studio at any given time, though on most days we only have about 1 staff member in the studio, which helps. All things considered, we've adapted well, and I think we've learned a lot this year, and we're looking forward to implementing some of these new practices into our regular workflows. Simplifying our documentation is an idea that we plan to keep around moving forward, and getting better at setting and meeting deadlines through more consistent use of FreeCamp. Those are some other things that we'll continue to focus on moving forward. And of course, it goes without saying that our work has been dramatically affected by COVID, and we're clearly still working to get back to some sense of normalcy. And we're taking it day by day, and our team has been quick on their feet and ready to adapt to all these frequent changes. So with that, we would like to see if there are any questions. Thank you all for listening.
I'm not sure if you can hear, there's an announcement going on in my library, so. But if you have any questions, please feel free to put it into the YouTube chat or in the Zoom chats, or if you are on the Zoom, feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. It's a very interesting presentation. I do have questions I would like to ask. You said that you guys, what is the average turnaround time? 2 weeks?
That used to be what our turnaround time was when it came to patron requests. I believe we don't officially have a turnaround time right now.
Oh, totally understand. But do you guys distinguish user type? Do you give priority? I totally understand that you will give priority for the teaching need. But what about the request from general public versus student faculty from FSU?
We typically work on a first come, first served basis. At least that is how we've done it in the past. I think right now we are potentially privileging a bit FSU students and faculty because Special Collections and Archives is closed. So they can't come in and use the materials as they normally would. That said, sometimes what they're requesting is going to take months for us to get ready and set for them. For example, we had a request come in for an entire serial that's in our Napoleon collection that will take 3-4 months to actually do totally. So what I've been doing with requests like that is batching them and communicating with the students saying, we can get maybe 5 volumes up each month. And seeing if that is reasonable, or working with them to see if there's like a volume or an item we could prioritize and get done immediately for them, and they could wait on the rest if it's a really large request. So we've just been trying to negotiate as best we can to try and get the material to folks as easily as possible right now.
Sure, that makes sense. Does this service is totally free? How this is different from your regular reference inquiry? People asking questions, you provide materials.
So yes, we don't charge for the service, and anyone can request it. They don't have to be affiliated with FSU in any way. It's simply another work stream for the DLC. So we try to balance its due dates against the due dates for our regular digitization projects, against any projects we might be doing with campus partners or community partners. So I try and keep time in the schedule for the DLC on a weekly basis to allow for these sorts of requests to come through and fit in. But as Stuart explained, we have run into issues where the DLC gets overwhelmed, and that's where expanding the patron-driven requests to have other special collection staff help has really been a benefit to both the DLC and to our patrons. I think people are getting things much more quickly now that it's not simply dependent on the DLC to get it to them.
So my last question is really all the digitized items that you guys upload into your digital library, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we, based on our experience, for example, the president letters, if we don't have a appropriate collection, how do you solve that kind of problem?
A collection to put them in the digital library, is that what you're asking?
Yes.
We will create a collection, even if we're only adding like 3 or 4 letters to it. Or we have topical collections in our digital library. So we may also look to see if the material's content fits better into one of the topical collections rather than creating a collection specifically for it.
Okay, thank you so much.
If anyone else has any questions before I jump in. So I am curious about platforms, and I just Googled DigiNole, so I was able to figure out that that's Islandora. What is the ticketing system that you're using? As well as, would you mind telling us more about FreeCamp?
Yeah, so we're using the RT ticketing system, and that's been working great for us. It's a nice collaborative tool. And it's all throughout the library. Each division, department can have a subset of tickets that go into different areas. So it's universally used within the libraries, but we've made our own instance of it for special collections and reproduction requests and reference requests. As for was the other question about FreeCamp? Yeah, we're using a FreeCamp project management tool. What was the question about that one again? Sorry.
If you just wouldn't mind speaking more about it, I'm just interested.
FreeCamp is something that we started using relatively recently, and it's taken a while to learn and to get everybody accustomed to using it consistently. But when used properly, it really does help keep projects on track. Similar to RT, it allows everybody who has access to go and track the progress of our projects. So we can see when projects are in a description phase, or when it's in a QC, or when it's in digitization. You can break it down into different sections within a project. You can also assign certain tasks to different users depending on where it is in the process. So you can assign it to somebody, you can set deadlines. So it's pretty flexible. They have a paid version and a free version. You can, of course, have different abilities to do different things depending on what version you're using. But we are planning to use it moving forward because it has really helped us keep on track, especially when working remotely with so many moving parts. It really helps everybody to kind of keep on track, to get on the same page when it's a little bit more tricky to do so. So yeah, we highly recommend FreeCamp.
And the RT tracker that you mentioned, is that paid as well?
I'm not too sure about that. Our IT folks have set it up for us. I'm not too sure. Crystal, do you know more about that?
No, IT takes care of it. I know nothing.
Well, thank you both. If there are any other questions, again, if you're in the YouTube, feel free to put it in the chat. And then if you are on Zoom, feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat as well. And because there is a delay with YouTube, we'll give it 15 to 30 seconds. There is a comment from Zoom. Thank you, this was great. And if there are no more questions, I'm going to end the stream. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Crystal and Stuart. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks everybody. Thanks for having us, and thanks for joining, y'all.
Yeah, great work. Take care.
Thank you.